I am, for one more week, the bilingual director at Donna ISD, and then starting in September, I will be teaching in the Literatures and Cultural Studies Department at UTRGV, mainly teaching young adult and children's literature, which is one of my great loves. I'm also an author of young adult literature, so I'm bringing a couple of different lenses to bear on the issue of Latino readers, struggling Latino readers especially, in ways that we can reach them. I taught for 14 years as a middle school and high school teacher, both in Donna ISD, McAllen High School, Idea Academy, Idea College Prep campus there in Donna. And I've worked with ELLs during that period of time and have seen a lot of interesting things that some of which have worked and others of which have not. And in putting together this presentation, I've tried to think from the lens of a teacher, scholar, university professor, writer, and bring all of those different perspectives to bear on the issue of young Latino readers. So my presentation is called Rabbit in the Moon. The reason I selected this as the title for a presentation on speculative fiction is the lunar goddess of the Maya, the moon goddess, the ancient stories tell us, always has this rabbit with her. You see in this image from a codex. And the reason for the rabbit is that the Maya explained the blotches on the moon by saying that a rabbit had been thrown at the moon. There's also something that you find in Aztec stories about the beginning of the fifth age, El Quinto Sol, when two different lights went into the sky, two different gods had sacrificed themselves to become the sun and the moon for the new world. But one of them was braver than the other, and so the gods, wanting to show him more glory, darkened the light, dimmed the light of the other by throwing a rabbit at it. And so I guess this is my way of tipping my hat to the existing kind of speculative elements already in Aztec and Maya, Mesoamerican mythology. Because to me it seems like there's this really interesting strand of speculation from those pre-Columbian times to the present in modern Latino speculative authors of science fiction and fantasy. And you may say to yourself, there are authors of science fiction and fantasy who are Latino? Granted, there aren't a whole bunch of them, pero sí los hay. Okay? And so we're going to talk a little bit about speculative fiction and working with Latino kids. But first, let's start by talking about the Latino kids themselves, right? What do we mean by young Latinos? In the RGV, in the Rio Grande Valley, there is no one-size-fits-all description of Latinos, right? You guys have worked with our English language learners in the Valley and also non-Lat kids who are Latino, and we know that there is such a diverse population of kids in our schools that it would be difficult to say, this is what a Latino in the RGV is. But we can definitely say that for the most part, the Latinos down here are of Mexican extraction. We're getting this new influx of refugees from Central America, so now we have Guatemaltecos and Hondureños, people like that. But for the most part, we are all of Mexican descent, those who are Latinos. But there's obviously this intersectionality of class, educational background, religion, generational distance from Latin America, so that we have our first generation recent immigrants all the way to people whose families have been living here for hundreds of years before this was Texas, before it was part of the United States, before even it was Mexico, back when it was New Spain, so the families go that far back, right? But definitely one thing that we can keep in mind, that though they all come from very diverse backgrounds, they all share the quality of being kind of in between cultures. I don't know if you've ever read Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, but she talks about Nepantla, which is a Nahuatl term, an Aztec term that means the middle. And Neplanteros are people who exist in the middle between two different cultures, kind of mediating the two different strands of language and ideology and religion and background. And so it's an interesting place to be in. And borders are kind of like the perfect laboratory for the combination and blending of cultures. And It's not always easy for young people growing up in border areas, especially when they're also trying to assimilate into 21st century. They want to be young Americans. They, you know, they're there with their Snapchat and their Tumblr accounts and all that stuff. So they're trying to be modern kids, but they also are deeply embedded in the cultural traditions and values of the Mexican American people. Now, we really feel this among English language learners, kids whose native language is Spanish and who are struggling to acquire a second language, right? We have, of course, as I said, those first generation immigrants, the recent immigrants, who often come in well beyond the normal time for beginning to acquire language, sometimes even in middle school and high school. And those kids have unique challenges because a lot of our middle schools and high schools aren't particularly well set up to get those kids through the second language acquisition process, and we end up immersing them more than perhaps research says we should. So we also have children of immigrants who, even though they come into school at the pre-K kinder level and are exposed to English immediately, are still in a household that mainly speaks Spanish, and so a lot of the influence, the linguistic influence on their lives is that. And then we have lots of kids who are in multilingual households. You know, these are like the third, fourth, fifth, and on generation. But these households a lot of times are mostly oral. In other words, there isn't as much literacy going on. There may be only a Bible in the house, or like a copy of the newspaper every Sunday or something like that. But for the most part, there isn't a lot of written word there. Here's a breakdown of some of the districts in Region 1 in the Rio Grande Valley, as indicated on the 2015 Texas Academic Performance Reports, as far as percentage of ELL. So you see that Progreso, La Joya, and Dana are all around or a little bit over 50%. And Dana ISD has been there for a very long time. And these percentages, when you compare them to the state, are well above the state percentages, which are under 20%, right, as far as statewide, the percentage of ELLs. And you'll see that all of our schools, to some extent, have this strong ELL population. And it's when you get to like La Feria, Harlingen, Lyford, Raymondville, those areas in Cameron County and Willacy that have like a smaller Lat population. And historically, they also have a smaller Latino population, a lot of those places.
So those percentages are reflecting what each individual perceives of themselves?
No,
because some people perceive themselves as white when they are Latinos, or vice versa.
Yeah, sure. But that's not what these percentages indicate what percentage of the students have been identified as English language learners. So that it doesn't speak to what percentage of them are Latinos. So obviously the percentage of Latinos, whether self-identified or not, would be much higher than this. The percentage of Latinos across the valley is in the 90% range, right? So this is specifically talking about our English language learners, those Latinos who are predominantly Spanish to learn English. And this is, of course, in our schools, pre-K through 12th grade. So why speculative fiction? Do you guys understand the term speculative fiction? It's kind of a catch-all term that includes fantasy, science fiction, horror, all these different genres of literature that kind of catch the public eye, and you see them a lot in our popular movies or television shows and so forth. So why should, when we're working with struggling Latinos, should we even think about speculative fiction? Why not use realistic fiction? Why not have fiction about life, as migrant farm workers, or life in the barrio, or the struggle against racism and inequality? All those things are valuable, very, very powerful pieces of literature, and some of our greatest literature for the Mexican American community deals with those themes and is very realistic. But there are some really, really solid reasons, I think, for using speculative fiction. The first one is that young people consume speculative literature, speculative fiction, whether in written or visual form. Publishers Weekly provides an annual breakdown of print book sales by category. And for the 2014 year, in the juvenile science fiction fantasy magic, Publishers Weekly reported that 45 million units were sold in 2014. That's a 38% increase over 2013. So that is an incredible number. 45 million books were sold in the area of juvenile science fiction, fantasy, and magic, speculative fiction. According to data compiled by RenTrack that keeps track of box office 4 different films. Every single one of the most successful live action movies and movie franchises for older kids and teens have been science fiction and fantasy. Every single one of them. So you think about the major blockbusters, both in literature and in movies, things like Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, the Percy Jackson books and films. All of these are speculative literature. And so if you think back to what I was telling you about Nepantla and about kids who are Nepantleros, but they're also navigating their way through 21st century skills and customs and mores, then you'll see that these kids are going to want to be like the mainstream and they're going to want to consume this sort of stuff. So it's a great way in to reaching them. All right, so I want to talk to you a little bit about that orality. I mentioned that a lot of these kids, a lot of these ELLs are coming from backgrounds that are mostly oral, so that you can kind of get a feel for how speculative fiction may also speak to that orality and help bridge the gap. Now, orality is a term coined by Walter Ong. And basically it's meant to be in opposition to literacy, to show you the opposite of it. So orality indicates that there's no exposure to writing, whereas residual orality means that there's been exposure to writing but no internalizing it, and still the culture is mainly oral. That's what happens in a lot of our households. They're not oral in the sense that, they don't know anything about writing and they can't read and things like that. They're able to read. They're not, they're functionally literate. However, they haven't internalized literacy. It isn't a part of their lives. It hasn't restructured their thinking yet. So they are what we consider residual oral communities or families. Now, orality has some really, really great advantages. And I don't mean just to imply by any stretch of the imagination that we should worry about our kids coming from these oral households, because orality has a lot of flexibility in the way that the stories are told. The stories are usually of a personal nature. They're related and embedded in the culture and family and community. There's a continuity in oral culture, so that ideas from the distant past are carried along into the present, and storytellers become kind of like repositories of the lore, what's important to the community, and it spreads itself up through time. As a result, there's a huge emphasis on memory. I'm sure that some of you guys have noticed this about your English language learners. If they read a text sometimes, they have a hard time comprehending and retaining information. They're decoding it, they're chunking it, they're trying to understand it, but it takes a lot of rereading for them to retain it. But if you tell them something, they will remember it for a very long time. And it's a really amazing thing how some kids are able to pass tests, not because they're studying their notes or anything like that, but because they remember what the teacher said. And this is one of the benefits of coming from a residual oral community. And then, of course, there's a focus on community. The storytellers are kind of like pillars of the community. The stories they tell are communal stories. They're not made up by one individual person, but they represent the lore of many, many years past. There's also this other thing that we call secondary orality. I don't know if you noticed this about the internet, for example. The web, when it first started, was a way to passively receive information, right? You would get online and you would read things, you would download photos, and over dial-up sometimes it would take forever. Remember the photo slowly line by line revealing itself? And you'd get up and go serve yourself some coffee and come back and it would still be... Well, we've gone from that passive reception of information to an active engagement in the web. It's Web 2.0, right? Where we are uploading videos of our cats doing ridiculous things, or we are, live streaming ourselves on Facebook, or whatever it happens to be. It's a great time of creativity, and a lot of it is oral. So that, rather than texting people now, or writing them messages, or typing up a blog, we are FaceTiming people, or doing a vlog, a video blog, right? And things of that nature. So there's this constant interplay, even in the present, with literacy and the secondary orality, this move back to the oral, the spoken word. Because there's something very different. Haven't you guys ever received an email from someone in which they're trying to deal with something that's a little touchy, and you get the wrong impression of their emotion, right? And you kind of feel like, oh, hey, wait a minute, what the heck, dude? that sounds like they're coming off in an aggressive, mean way, and they're not at all. They're just trying to be really brief and to the point. Whereas when you talk to them in person, they're like, oh no, don't take it the wrong way. And you see their facial expressions and their gestures, and they're humble and ducking their heads and apologetic about the misinterpretation of their original message. We, as human beings, like that visual input, and so secondary orality, being able to hear the tone that somebody's using and to see their gestures and understand their emotions is super important to us. Now, thinking about orality and folklore, as I suggested to you, we have these storytellers who are the repositories of lore down the generations. And we can kind of think of that folklore as a collective fund of knowledge that's dependent on orality. Our funds of knowledge, the things that we learn in our households and our communities when we're children, things we pick up, how to wash the dishes, how one treats one's elders, all these different things that we discover about the world, our proper role in it, and so forth. Folklore is definitely one of them. And a lot of our local tales have been collected by scholars, people like Jovita Gonzalez, Americo Paredes, Mark Glazer, Jose Limon, Juan Sobajo, whose Stories That Must Not Die was something I used a lot in my classroom at the middle school level. And there's been a scholarly interest in these tales and investigation and study for the past century or so. And as a result, we've learned some interesting things about folklore. Oral storytelling tends to have certain characteristics. It's very formulaic. Patterns are repeated. One of the most common patterns, as discovered by Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, is the monomyth, or the hero's journey, right? Where somebody is called to action. There's something that they have to go off and do. They go on this quest. They usually have helpers along the way. They go and find whatever it is they need, and then they come back to their community with that new thing and share it for the benefit of all. And this is a pattern that you see repeated over and over again. One of the interesting things about patterns in oral storytelling is that they're very satisfying. At the end of it, you're satisfied. I always hear people saying, I love literature, but I wish there were more books with happy endings. I love happy endings. I was presenting in Corpus Christi with Marshall Mickelson, and she was talking about that desire for happy endings. Because there's something psychologically satisfying and very rooted in our folkloric communal culture that says that we want to have formula that we recognize, and it helps us to predict, right, what's going to happen next, and not to feel too anxious about what's going to happen to our protagonist. Oral storytelling also tends to be agonistic, so that there's a lot of interpersonal conflict. It's not interior conflict. It's not like the person struggling inside of himself. Because in oral storytelling, the person is part of his culture. His personality and his role and so forth has been largely defined by the people around him. So he doesn't need to struggle inside to decide what to do. His struggles are with external forces, with villains and monsters and demons and all kinds of natural obstacles as well. It's situational instead of abstract. You'll notice in a lot of folkloric storytelling that things happen in like little chunks, little discrete chunks. It's very episodic, right? There isn't a lot of abstract sitting around and talking and debating and stuff like that. No, you're in a situation, bad things arise, you have to overcome the bad things and move on to the next situation. And it's participatory. So you ever been sitting around a campfire while your tío, your abuelito is telling a story, right? And everybody's like, así no, abuelito, es que acuérdese que la tía Jovita hizo esto, lo otro. So they interpose different ideas, and then maybe somebody who's new to the storytelling will be like, after the story's told, well, but in mi rancho, the way we tell the story is da-da-da-da-da. So it's participatory. Everybody is involved in the storytelling, adjusting it, and so forth. And the storyteller also adjusts his tale in accordance with the people who are present. So it's definitely something that everybody gets involved. And what's interesting about this is all of these elements are found in genre fiction. And a lot of times genre fiction is derided for using this. It's considered childish and old-fashioned and so forth. It's not literature because it doesn't engage in a lot of philosophical wrangling and hand-wringing about fate and so forth. But it's precisely those things that make genre fiction such an awesome tool for working with young Latinos who are coming out of an oral culture. So as I said, storytellers are repositories and guardians of shared lore. And folkloric tales are part of that community identity. As a result, those of us who have either moved out of our residual oral cultures into a more literate culture, and a lot of us who, like me, maybe the first people in your family to go to college, I'm sure that there are people in this room that are like that, or one of the first, and you move out of that kind of family into a college environment, a scholarly environment, you go on, maybe get your master's as well, you read a lot, those of you who are like English teachers are working with literature, and it's easy to slowly begin to separate yourself, whether you meaningfully do it or not, so that you become a completely literate person, academic person who kind of is like, oh yeah, that was a different time in my life. But we have to be careful when we're looking at children from that academic, intellectual perspective, because children who have a lot of residual orality are not less intelligent than other kids. Not at all. They simply have not internalized literacy yet. Think about a typical elementary classroom. You have a kid who's coming from a residual oral family. He grew up hearing his family members tell him stories. No one read to him, however. And the syntactic patterns of oral storytelling are very, they add things, they're additive rather than subordinating. So for example, somebody will be telling a story and they'll be like, I went to the store and I saw my friend and he asked me what I was doing there and I told him that I was going to buy some candy and he asked me to buy some for him. You see how additive that is rather than saying, when I went to the store, I encountered my friend. He asked me what I was doing there, so I explained to him that I was buying candy, at which time he requested that I purchase some for him. You see how very different the language is? Not just the words, but the structure of the language itself. Yes, the connections, so that you're subordinating ideas. When you're coordinating ideas in this additive fashion, like you do in oral storytelling, every idea is equally important, right? And so a kid from a more affluent household whose parents have read to him when he's growing up, when he's like a little child, when he goes into school, he's used to the rhythms of written English as well as spoken English. And so when the teacher begins speaking, when she reads from a book, there is no cognitive dissonance. He's already become accustomed to it. A child from a residual oral household, however, to him it might as well be a different language. It's very jarring. He's not used to words being strung together that way. And then if English is not even his first language, it's tough. And even when you take a residual oral kid from a dominant Spanish background, you put him in a bilingual program, and you're beginning to teach him to read in Spanish, you're going to encounter the same things. The kid needs to learn the rhythms of written Spanish as well. It's kind of complicated, right? But they are equally as intelligent as any other kid. They just haven't been exposed to literacy. And so it takes more work to get them where they need to be, right? In order to be successful academically. So we can use that residual orality to co-opt it into literacy, right? Now, one of the things that when I was a middle school teacher, I always used to laugh at my kids. It was, oh, sir, I love this book, or I love this story, I love this movie, I love whatever. And I would ask them, why? What did you love about it? And they would tell me, oh, because it was so cool. What was cool about it? I don't know, sir, it was just cool. And so over time, I thought about this. The kids are saying this for a reason. The problem is we don't have the right definition for cool. And so after working with kids for a while, I came up with my scholarly definition of coolness, right? So that I could mentally not freak out every time they told me it was cool, and I could kind of guide them. So my definition of coolness is cultural relevance, right? Text is culturally relevant to the student. It's developmentally appropriate so that the kid at that particular age level or his individual cognitive development fit well with the text, and it has a high interest level so that his personal interests are reflected in the book as well. When you have those three things, then he's going to say, "Está chido," right? It's cool, right? "Está chido, sir." Or sometimes I would have the little gamers like, "Está perrón, sir." I'd be like, "You can't talk that way in my class." "Ah, sir," and they'll say, "No, okay," and I'm not mad. I just don't want the principal to walk in and hear you saying this. This is one of the kind of things that you have to do sometimes. Kids come from households where there's a lot of vulgarity, and that will come up in their classroom practice. In your classroom. Bridging the gap between genre fiction and literary fiction can happen later on. Once you get them hooked by bringing them in contact with cool text and get them loving cool text, then you can start getting them to love language, getting them to love the flow of written language, and then bridge the gap from that speculative literature that's cool for them into, our more canonical literature or our modern literature. And then obviously becoming literate expands your cultural knowledge, expands the relevance for you so that more things will be cool for you, right? So there's kind of like a continuum of speculative fiction, if you will, that I like to think about. We've got our timeless folklore, the things that we hear as oral cultures, and a lot of times, a lot of the work that I've done in my books, like Border Lore, has been retelling these folk tales in a way that also makes them kind of like short stories. It embeds them in the craft and forms of written fiction. We have urban legends that we all love and grown up with, and nowadays we have like a subset of urban legends that kids love called creepy pasta. I don't know if you've heard of creepy pasta, but if you talk to teenagers right now, they know what creepy pasta is and they love it. They're basically internet urban legends, right? Then contextualize or historicize folktales and legends, which is the next step from just retelling the folktales, embedding them in context and making them feel more like they actually happened, with real-world characters, and I've done a lot of that as well. And of course, we have our realistic fiction that a lot of us love to teach. Some of the people in this room may not be fans of speculative fiction. I know my wife, for example, when I start talking about science fiction fans, she's like, tú y tus extraterrestres y duendes, yeah? O sea, a mí dame cosas de la vida real. She wants real stuff, not zombies and fairies and aliens and so forth. To her, it feels silly, right? But she, at the same time, recognizes that I love it, our kids love it, and so she's like, let's us run with that. Or there's a great movie out, and we're like, oh, come see this, the new Harry Potter film or whatever it happens to be. And she's like, no, sis, buy in, enjoy it yourselves. I'm gonna stay home, and yeah, I'll wait here doing stuff that's real for me. And that's fine. Folkloric and mythic fantasy and magical realism are the next in that list. And then we've got our urban fantasy, near future sci-fi, weird and horror, and then high fantasy and space opera. So in the middle, from realistic fiction, or from contextualized or historicized folktales through magical realism, those are a little more realistic. They feel more real world. And then the other ones, as you get out on the continuum, get increasingly less connected to the real world. Okay, so text, selecting text. Okay, Bulls, I buy into this idea. Ya me convenciste. I want to select some speculative fiction text. How do I do it? How do I go about finding diverse texts for my Latino readers? Well, there's a major issue right off the bat. There aren't as many diverse texts as we'd like there to be, right? Research by the Cooperative Children's Book Center, and you can find their website online, it's really, really fantastic, shows that only 10% of books that were published for children in the last 10 years have featured a person of color as a protagonist. Only 10%. It's crazy, right? Studies by Lee and Lowe, the New York publisher specializing in diverse children's literature, suggest that this trend goes back at least 21 years, the data that we have, probably even further than that. Now, 2014 and 2015 have shown some improvement. About 14% of children's books now feature a person of color as a protagonist. And by person of color, everyone understands that I'm talking about a minority, right? African American, huh? Well, yeah, I mean, she would be counted as, yeah, so if you have Pocahontas as the protagonist in your book, then that would be considered a person of color, right? African American, Asian American, Latino, somebody in one of those groups, Native American. Lee and Lowe's diversity baseline survey that they sent out to all these different publishers in the industry to find out what the makeup of the actual people running the industry was, has found some really startling things. So you're asking yourself, how come only 14% of the books are about people of color? What's going on? Well, when you look at the breakdown of the people working in the industry, they're overwhelmingly white, 79% of them. 78% of them are cis female, it's born female. 88% of them heterosexual, and 92% of them are non-disabled. So that suggests that there may be an inherent bias in some of those people. And what's really interesting is that most of these report themselves to be politically, ideologically on the left. They're not like right-wing people. They're on the left. But it also goes to show that despite all of your efforts to be open-minded and diverse, you know, the culture that you grew up in influences your choices of manuscripts. Yes, you were going to say something.
My observation is that maybe we see those numbers because the writers represent their own color in their stories, and probably the majority of the writers back then were white.
Yeah, and even now it still is true. Even now it still is true. And why are the majority of the writers white? See, because how do writers get published? To get published in the 4 big publishing companies, you have to have an agent. Agent has to pitch your work to a publisher, and a publisher has to choose your work, has to select your work. And so if what's happening is they are selecting more work by Anglo-Americans because it fits a paradigm they have internalized from their own culture, that suggests a problem. And so if we're going to have greater diversity that reflects the population better, then those people have to make a stronger effort to open their minds and not just automatically go, oh, well, this book doesn't read like the books I'm used to reading. It doesn't feel the same, doesn't have the same structure. I'm not going to publish it because we won't be able to sell it. That mentality is what underlines a lot of it. What can sell? What are people going to buy? Census data in the US, and it should say data, not date, sorry, shows that the US is 38% POC, not 14 or 10% like what's being reflected in the publishing, right?
Excuse me.
Yes, of course.
Can I add to what you just said?
Certainly, please do.
And what you were saying about them not publishing certain books. If you consider that the curriculum is not written for the Hispanic or the Latino, then it also explains the reason why these books are not published.
Sure, yeah.
If you think of the curriculum, if you think of our curriculum, how it's written, it's not written tailored to our students or tailored to Latinos. It's written for a general audience, which is white.
Sure, exactly. And so, which suggests to me that we really have to push for locally created curricula, right? So that there are more and more Latino-dominant school districts that are creating curricula that are centered on the needs of Latinos, and there's greater demand on the marketplace, so that we're buying more books, and then publishers will say, oh, okay, this is something that's profitable. There is a demand for it. So yeah, I mean, definitely there are all kinds of factors that play into it, and we don't want to oversimplify it. Continuing with this, the Cooperative Children's Book Center has also reported some specific things about not only the books being written about people of color, but being written by. So 2014, 398 books were published that had people of color as the protagonists, right? Only 168 of those books were actually written by people of color or illustrated by them. So that means that 57 of the books that have people of color were written by somebody outside of that culture. So maybe, an Anglo-American writing about Pocahontas would be an example of something that we have talked about, right? Now, you need to note that people of color produced 292 books, not just 168, because obviously there are people of color who are writing about Anglo-American kids, and that's obviously perfectly fine, right? Now, when we're talking books, we're talking 398 children and young adult books, not just all. There were more books written for adults and so forth. 495 books about people of color that were published last year in 2015, only 186 of them were written and illustrated by people of color, so that means 62% were created by someone outside of that culture. And again, there were 348 books written for children by people of color. Not all of them wrote, none of them chose to write about people of color. Now, and we can have our opinions about that. Authors should be able to write about what they want to write about. We would love for more Latinos to write about Latinos, right? And for more Latino authors to decide to write children's literature, because we have a lot of Latinos writing poetry and writing scholarly work and writing realistic fiction for adults and so forth. And I'm always out there, all my author friends telling them, escribir un libro para niños o para adolescentes, contribute in some way, come on. And they're like, bulls, quit trying to micromanage my writing career, please. Now, so going from people of color down to Latinos, right? So Latino Kid Lit, 2014, 66 books were published about Latinos. That is it, out of all books for children that were published. Only 36 of those were written and illustrated by Latinos. Now here's one more layer. 23 of those 36 had no significant Latino cultural content. So there's like a Latino kid, like his name is Alex Rodriguez, but like nothing that happens in the book has anything to do with his culture. He might as well just be named John Doe, right? Or Jimmy Smith. because he's got nothing Latino at all in his life. So basically, only 13 out of 66, 20% of the books that were published for Latino kids last year, in 2014, had true cultural relevance. And to me, we talked about that coolness factor. Those kids they need to be culturally relevant. And of course, few of those are genre novels. Very few of them are at all speculative fiction. Last year, we had 82 books published about Latinos. 57 of them were written or illustrated by Latinos. 17 of those had no significant cultural content, so it was better. 40 out of 82, 49% of the books published last year have true cultural relevance. So, where can we find these? What time is it right now? I want to make sure that we're on track.
9:35.
Okay, good. Doing fine. Now, to find these things, you sometimes have to do a little digging, but luckily, in the past few years, there has been an enormous surge in solidarity, unifying around the issue of making sure there's enough diverse children's literature out there. So if we're looking for true cultural relevance in Latino speculative or genre fiction, we want to select texts in which Latino identity isn't just superficial, but deeply woven into narrative and characterization. One of the irritating things that happens, and I was reading a thread about this on some website, I can't remember right now, or maybe it was Twitter or something like that. The whole gotcha moment, when we've been reading a book all along, and the character has kind of a generic name, and at the very end of the book, it's revealed, oh, and he's African American, or oh, and he's Latino, oh, he's an Asian. As if the idea is to say, see, you can have a colorblind world. You don't have to. When people are not inherently racist, there's not. You can write about children as just children without making reference to their culture and so forth. And a lot of people who are writers of color find it very, very irritating, very, very tricky, and counterproductive. As if as if pulling children of color out of their cultural context and just placing them in a generic American background is suddenly like the thing we want to do and acceptable in the worldview we want to promote. The majority of us feel, no, that's ridiculous. You don't have to give up one to have the other. Puedes tener tu cultura, la cultura de tu familia, tu idioma, todo lo demás, and you can also have mainstream American culture on top of that. You don't have to decide between them. You don't have to pick one language over the other, right? You can have both things. So a good place to start, I would recommend going to Latinos and Kidlit. I think they've rebranded to Latinx and Kidlit, but the website is still the same, latinosandkidlit.com. They have a great up-to-date list of all of the young adult and children fiction written by Latinos for Latinos. I would also recommend taking a look at books that have been selected for the Puro del Pre Awards, for the Tomás Rivera, for Las Americas, and those kinds of things. Those lists go back, the Puro del Pre this year is celebrating its 20th anniversary, so there's 20 years of books there. Tomás Rivera has about a decade, I would say. Las Americas Award goes back about a decade as well. And then there are organizations like Reforma, ALCS, Class, and other organizations that have useful lists. And you can find these things online. And now there's this proliferation. If you just Google diverse books, Latino literature for young adults and children, you'll find lots of really, really good lists. Here's some examples. I'm just walking through some example books and why I decided that these would be perfect, that these are cool, right? These have the coolness factor for our kids. Shadow Shaper by Daniel Jose Olde is a young adult book. It's an urban fantasy set in New York City. It's by a Latino author, and Latino culture is integral to the plot and to the characterization. So you could not divorce. If you pulled the Latino culture out of it, the book would be meaningless and fall in on itself. And that's what cultural relevance really, really means, to have that culture integrated that well. And it's a really fantastic book that's won a lot of awards, and I highly recommend it. Okay? It's about Sierra Santiago and magical graffiti and stuff like that. It's a really, really fantastic book that I think a lot of kids would like. Ambassador is a middle grades book by William Alexander, a Cubano, really neat guy. It's science fiction. It's written obviously by a Latino, and the Latino culture is definitely integral to the characters in his family subplot. In this book, Gabe Fuentes' parents are undocumented non-citizens in the United States. And as he is being selected as ambassador to this intergalactic organization, the ambassador from Earth, he's also dealing with the fact that the immigration services in the United States are trying to deport his parents and separate families. A really, really powerful, timely book. And it's a series, so the second book has come out, and the third book is coming out pretty soon as well. Great series. Very funny too, which is what you want definitely in a middle grades book. You want them to deal with serious, important, culturally relevant things, but you also want a lot of humor, because middle school kids love humor, especially boys. You've got to crack them up, and there's some great stuff in there. Summer of the Mariposas by Guadalupe Garcia McCall, who's just a beautiful person. It's really, really great. This book has won the Pré Award, and it's been recognized over and over. It's kind of like a Mexican-American take on the Odyssey in some ways. It's a fantasy novel, and some people might argue that it's magical realism, but I definitely think it edges more into fantasy than magical realism. It's by a Latino author. She's a teacher in South Texas. And Latino culture and mythology are integral to the characterization and the plot. And here you have Odilia and her four sisters, the Garza sisters, and they find a dead body in a branch of the Rio Grande, and they go on like this journey to return it to Mexico. Really, really fantastic. More Happy Than Not, which came out last year. Very, very amazing book that grapples with some like tough stuff. Definitely for teenagers, probably juniors and seniors more. But yeah, I think freshmen, sophomore could do it as well. Just because some of the things that it grapples with, right? Ana Silvera is a very daring author, and deals with things like suicide and sexual orientation in a near future setting where you can have your memories removed through a procedure. And a young man who is grappling with his own sexuality and with the loss of his father through suicide is contemplating whether to have his memories removed and change basically his identity and try to not be who he's turning into. And it's just a struggle with accepting oneself and pushing against society that might not be accepting it. It's definitely science fiction. Like I said, it's near future science fiction. It's by a Latino author, and the Latino culture is integral to the characterization in the subplots. And then, oh my God, there's this book, right? This guy named David Bowles, right? So, my book, it's a middle grade to young adult novel. It's a fantasy book. It's kind of on the vein of like Percy Jackson, where you have kids who are up against mythological creatures, but in this case, it's twins who are Mexican Americans from the Rio Grande Valley who are facing off against Aztec and Mayan gods. It's written by me, and I am Mexican American, and the Latino culture is integral to characterization and subplots. Like, you definitely could not pull out Latino culture. Like, the first couple of chapters are set in the Rio Grande Valley in Donna, Texas. Write about what you know right now. And then other chapters set in Mexico, and then in the Aztec underworld. And you clearly could not remove any of that and have the book make any sense at all. And it's, I'm going to be in Orlando in a week getting my Pura del Prey honor awards. What time is it right now? I probably have full time. Huh?
9:43.
Okay, just really quickly, I just threw in here very quickly some instructional strategies, just things for you to think about. I'm not going to talk about them too much, but when you're working with them, keeping in mind the reading process. A lot of people push the writing process, but we're not always as reflective about the reading process. So kids need pre-reading activities that prep them, much like we do brainstorming before we write. Things that are going to activate their prior knowledge, kind of prime the pump so that as they enter the reading, they've already got things activated in their schema. Their original funds of knowledge have been kind of like drawn from to connect to the story. And then active reading, making sure that as kids read, there's a purpose to the reading, maybe some kind of anticipation guide with questions that they're going through and thinking about, maybe some other kind of strategy where they're assessing their understanding of chunks of text as they go. And then time to respond, whether it's journaling about it or discussing it or reflecting in some way about their reading. And then exploring and applying some of the learning that they've pulled from it. Like, if they're reading a book like Summer of the Mariposas, in which Mexican mythology is talked about, like La Llorona and Don Nantzin, the goddess, and things like that, you then want kids to go explore those concepts and those figures in more detail on their own so that they deepen their appreciation and understanding of the text. Reading workshop is probably really the only way to make that happen. So a reading workshop allows kids to be reading at different paces, to be at different places in the reading process, to be working in literature circles and other small group discussions so that they're able to communicate their thoughts and reflect and so forth and get the support they need. And in a reading workshop kind of setting, the teacher is then able to pull struggling readers aside and do mini lessons and read alouds and stuff, think alouds with them, while kids are independently or in groups working on other things. So reading workshop is definitely something that I suggest. Nancy Atwell and Dr. Joyce Carroll are a couple of the major innovators in that, and you can find tons of information about it online. And you can see that the workshop basically breaks down to a mini lesson, time for reading and conferring, so that kids are independently reading and teachers conferring on one-on-one or in small groups with people, and then share time, where either in their groups they're sharing out, or you have the author chair where somebody sits down and talks a little bit or reads aloud about whatever it is that they've been dealing with. Another thing that I definitely recommend is something that Region 1 supports a lot, and that's Project Excel from Dr. Margarita Calderon, a system for working with struggling readers, building out their academic vocabulary and providing a suite of different supports. The framework basically stems from three major assumptions. You need to have 100% student interaction in order for a classroom for ELLs to really be successful. Kids need to have semantic awareness. They need to know in a metacognitive way what their vocabulary difficulties are, what the different types of words are, and have goals for themselves for acquiring that vocabulary, and be co-participants in the acquisition of language. And then reading comprehension has to be explicitly taught, and especially in some of the ways that I've been discussing with that active reading and so forth. Okay? If you're interested in, this goes on to talk a little bit more about Excel. If you're interested in learning more about some of these things or contacting me, my website is davidbowles.us. You can find also teacher resources for my books there, but you'll find like links to articles and stories and different things and appearances I'm going to have, and my email address. So if you want to shoot me a message, ask questions, whatever, I'm always really, really happy to work with the educational community in the Valley to better the experience that our ELLs have in these classrooms. So we've got like a teensy bit of time left, just like maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Does anybody have like a question they want to throw out before we go? Yes?
Have you written anything in Reader's Theater, play, or?
No, but it's definitely something that I'm interested in doing, and one of the exciting things about moving to the university setting is it's going to give me more flexibility, more time to, and obviously there's pressure to write and publish when you're at the university. There are things that I want to do. Right now, I've been working in writing script for television shows that I'm producing, that I'm working with some producers to develop. And so I'm really getting into the whole idea of scripting and so forth. So Reader's Theater is something that I really want to explore. So yeah, that's one of my upcoming dream projects.
It's a wonderful tool to use with English language learners, struggling readers, and more so when it comes from a Latino author.
Exactly, and it's authentic.
They're very, very limited.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I was a teacher, I used Reader's Theater at the middle school level, and it's tough to find materials. And you kind of have to, one of the reasons that some of the things that pushed me into creating retelling of folklore was the dearth of literature like that. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of theater, I went to school with a guy who is now a screenwriter and a screenwriter actually, and his name is Alvaro Sarrios, and he writes some awesome plays, Latino based. His last one's called Luchadora.
Oh wow.
Alvaro Sarrios. He lives in Wisconsin now. His wife is in grad school, but he's originally from Houston. And there's also Arte Público Press and Piñata Books, which publishes all Hispanic authors or
And then-
books about Hispanic.
And there's Cinco Puntos also.
Right.
Yeah.
They're all exclusively.
And like I said, Lee and Lowe has lots of multicultural stuff, including lots of Latino literature. So it's on the rise. There are people who are working really, really hard to put it out. Well, unless there are any other questions, thank you so much. You guys enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, weekend. It's already Monday. Oh my God. It feels like it's still the weekend, right? Well, you guys pretend like it's the weekend tonight, right? Before tomorrow's session. Awesome. Thank you very much. There's labels for you so you get credit.
Labels for one.
For you to get credit.
We put them.